This is after 572 schools have been identified that contain the type of concrete that is at risk of structural failure. And the latest on that story is that Jonathan Slater, who was a permanent secretary at the Department for Education from 2016 to 2020, has revealed that ministers ignored pleas to rebuild more schools. Now, that was despite warnings that the crumbling concrete posed, and I quote, critical risk to life. The government was told they needed to rebuild 300 to 400 schools a year. They agreed to fund 100 schools a year and then just 50 a year. Now, that was in 2021, a spending review by the then Chancellor, Rishi Sunak. And this is what he had to say about it.
Are you to blame for what's happening now? And do you want to apologise to parents and pupils?
I think that is completely and utterly wrong. Actually, one of the first things I did as Chancellor in my first spending review in 2020 was to announce a new 10-year school rebuilding programme for 500 schools. Now, that equates to about 50 schools a year that will be refurbished or rebuilt. And if you look at what we've been doing over the previous decade, that's completely in line with what we've always done, about 50 or so schools a year refurbished or rebuilt. That's what I announced as Chancellor in my first spending review.
Now, this is St Thomas More Comprehensive School in southeast London, where they've had to set up portaloos because of the crumbling concrete. Marina, in a sense, Rishi Sunak then confirmed that he was sort of to blame because the government had already agreed to fund 100 schools and then he cut that down to 50 schools. What are your thoughts?
I think this is a collective effort on behalf of the Conservatives and 13 years of Conservative rule. Rishi Sunak obviously has a part to play here. He admitted as much there that he was advised to provide funding for 400 schools. Under his, as he was Chancellor, he reduced that funding to 50. And when schools are crumbling, and they've had this since, I think it was 2016 was the first, but then 2018 was...
2018 there was a ledge that fell, yeah.
So they've known about this for a while. If schools are crumbling, you don't announce a 10-year plan. This is an ASAP, this is urgent, we need to address this. Labour had a plan in place. Michael Gove scrapped it. It was this rebuilding plan. I think there was billions set aside for it.
It was the Building Schools for the Future programme.
Precisely. And I don't think many people know about this, but a High Court judge found this to be, what Michael Gove did there by scrapping that, a High Court judge actually found it to be so unfair, his scrapping of that, they called it an abuse of power. And something you have to bear in mind is, again, the fact that they're not even revealing to you, like so many of these schools, like which schools are crumbling. You've got to bear in mind 65% of Sunak's cabinet went to private school. Where do you think their children are going? If their kids were in these schools where there was a risk to life, and by the way, I've known about this, I tweeted about this, and I'm not in the government, I tweeted about this back in June because it was being, the National Audit Office warned about it. How on earth is it that we have a government that the day before is sending out on Twitter asking people to fill in a questionnaire about how much of this this concrete is used in schools? They are so incompetent. If their children were in these schools, they wouldn't be doing this.
James, rather triumphantly, the Prime Minister also said in that interview that 95% of schools are safe. Is that what you want to hear as a parent, that there are 5% of schools that we don't know about that are unsafe? Is that good PR?
No, it's not good PR, but I think there are a lot of things which are wrong with this story. So, first of all, I think the political blame storming is appalling. Look, you've trotted out the same old stuff that you would always... I think
who's at fault, James?
I think...
Who's at fault, James?
But I think...
Is it Labour?
No, but here's the point. Here's the point, which I think is really important when it comes to dealing with schools. Nobody in politics seems to understand or bother to understand real estate. If you have real estate, we're talking about buildings which are mostly built in the 50s and the 60s, and most people are pretty aware as to the shortcomings of buildings in their lives. And so you've got a senior civil servant who's pointing the finger of blame, saying, oh, it's not me, we had this rebuilding plan. You know, this rack concrete is actually perfectly fine as long as it's maintained and looked after properly. It doesn't suddenly have a life and then expire. It only expires if it's treated badly and if it's not looked after properly. So we have an issue here, and I think that we as a nation should just step back from the politics a second and step back from whether they're private schools or public schools or whatever else, because I went to a school that, by the way, did have an awful lot of that concrete in it, and it happened to be fee-paying, so it happens there too. So let's just deal with what needs to be done in terms of our infrastructure. And
Which is what Labour tried to do. So Labour actually see this as a problem.
Labour just said...
And they set aside a great chunk of money, actually, to deal with it. So they foresaw this.
They didn't. No, they didn't. What they wanted to do was they just wanted to rebuild schools.
Terrible.
No, but there's nothing wrong with rebuilding schools that need to be rebuilt. But they started to rebuild schools that didn't need rebuilding. What you actually need to do is you need to look at resources and use them effectively. And this is why so many people in politics, and I don't care whether they're Labour and just want to knock everything down and build new stuff, or whether they're Conservatives who look away and point the finger of blame at somebody else. And in fact, there's also a role here of the civil service, who frankly should be responsible for the government's real estate assets and portfolio, and local authorities who are charged with looking after schools.
The civil service made the recommendation. There were 400 schools, up to 400 schools, at risk. The government chose to ignore that risk.
Listen, I'm not sure necessarily whether we got the bottom of all the data here. That just because the civil service say that they want to do something, I'm sorry, but they don't always get it right. So my view is, let's stop with the political blame storming. I don't think that the government's coming out with a huge, halo here, but I do think that we need to be stepping back from just having a blame of the Prime Minister or the Education Secretary and saying, look, something's gone terribly wrong here, which I would agree with you, and also announcing it the day before they go back to school.
All right.
It's been managed badly.
Let's find out what people are saying at home. Darryl in Staffordshire. Good afternoon, Darryl. Do you think the Prime Minister is to blame?
Good afternoon, Alex. Good afternoon, panel. I don't think Rishi Sunak is to blame. Mm-hmm. I think that it would be down to the education secretaries over the years why the schools are crumbling.
OK. I can tell you that Gillian Keegan, the Education Secretary, today's Education Secretary, is saying, well, actually, if you look at the small print, the Education Department is not responsible for the upkeep of the buildings. That it comes down to the local authorities. So are we just going to see people just endlessly passing the buck to someone else? Who has to take responsibility, Darryl? Well,
obviously local authorities, but primarily I would say that it would be the Education Secretary that sits at the top of that, that pile.
Mm-hmm. What do you make of the fact that the last Labour government put in what's called the Building Schools for the Future? Everybody's mentioned it here on the panel. Michael Gove came in as Education Secretary. He cancelled it. Years later, to give Michael Gove his credit, he has stated that cancelling the programme was one of the biggest mistakes in office. So are we seeing the last 13 years of Conservative government being partially at least responsible for the demise of the schools? Would you agree with that?
Yeah, possibly, Alex. Obviously, if something's been put in place and then he takes it away and then obviously brings it back again, he can clearly see that there's been some kind of issue, there's been some kind of problem.
Do you have kids, Darryl?
I do, yes.
Are you comfortable sending them to school? Do you feel 100% secure when you hear the Prime Minister saying 95% of schools are safe, i.e. 5% of schools might not be safe?
I can only speak from my own preferences, Alex, that my daughter goes to quite a good school and it's in a really good standard. So from my own point of view, I feel quite safe letting my child go to school. I do understand there's probably millions of parents out there with children, they're worried about the state of the schools and things like that. But like I say, from my own point of view, the school that my daughter goes to is in a really good standard.
OK. Darryl, good to talk to you. Thanks for calling in. Billy in South Ayrshire. Good afternoon, Billy. What do you make of this story? Is James right, trying to find a scapegoat to blame all this on, possibly not doing anyone any favours?
It's not doing anybody any favours when you basically point the finger of blame at Rishi Sunak or anybody else. But I've actually been following this story, and the main question that has always been on my mind is this. Kids without additional support needs will obviously be able to cope with the fact that they can't go to school because their school maybe has a problem because it's been built with this rack concrete. But there are children out there with additional support needs, mainly autistic children who find it difficult to cope with certain situations. So you've got a child with autism and you turn round and tell them, right, you're not going to school today because of this, that and the next thing. How do we explain to children with additional support needs, not just children with autism, that the school is closed because of this concrete issue? How do we explain that to children with additional support needs?
Billy, thank you. It's going to be difficult for many parents, many kids across the country. We've heard that some schools may be affected on average about 6 weeks. That's a long time to keep kids out of school.
We also, don't forget, we had this during COVID, when kids were told they were going back to school, then they went back to school for one day, then Gavin Williamson, Education Minister at the time, changed his mind, and then kids were pulled out of school again. So we've had this just uncertainty. Kids have just been really messed around by this government. But again, I just want to stress, if their kids were in these schools when the National Audit Office, back when I tweeted about it in June, July, said there was a risk of death or serious injury to 700,000 pupils, if ministers had their kids in these schools, they would have done something about it.
OK, we're going to take a very quick call from John in Dundee. Good afternoon, John. What would you like to say?
Good afternoon. I don't think you can just primarily blame Rishi Sunak for the problem. I think, basically, the Tories have been in power for the last 13 years. They could have dealt with the situation in that period of time. They go on about how Labour did nothing about it. Well, maybe Labour did nothing about it, but like I say, you've been in power for the last 13 years. You knew the problem was there. You deal with it then. You make that one of your priorities. This is the problem half the time. Parties, they say, we're going to spend money on this, we're going to spend money on that. If you know there's a serious issue, you spend money on it there and then. This could have become like another Grenfell, and you wouldn't want that at all. It's just, I hate when they slag each other off. Actually deal with the situation and don't just blame everybody else for something that you could deal with.